What would you do if you walked into the most powerful room in the city with nothing but an old bag, a torn jacket, and 14 families depending on your every word? Would you turn back at the door, or would you walk straight in and refuse to blink? Before we go any further, if this story moves something inside you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We truly love hearing from you, and every single comment means the world to us. Now, let us talk about Daniel Ware. Daniel was not the kind of man who walked into rooms like that every day. He was not wearing a sharp suit. He was not carrying a leather briefcase that cost more than most people earn in a month. What he had was a brown satchel, so worn that the strap had been stitched back together twice, and a jacket with a small tear near the left pocket that he had never quite gotten around to fixing. He had been meaning to fix it for 3 years. There was always something more urgent. That morning, he stood outside the tall glass building on Commerce Avenue and looked up at it the way you look at a mountain you have been told you cannot climb. The building was clean and cold and shining. It seemed to have no interest in him whatsoever. A man in a dark coat walked past him without looking up. 2 women in heels clicked by, talking fast into their phones. Nobody noticed Daniel. That was nothing new. He had been easy to ignore for 9 days. 9 days of letters sent to addresses that received them and did nothing. 9 days of phone calls that rang, and then dropped into voicemail boxes that were either full or never checked. 9 days of walking into offices and being told to wait, and then waiting, and then being told the person he needed was in a meeting, and then being told come back, and then coming back, and being told the same thing again. He had sat in 3 different waiting rooms with chairs that were designed to make you feel small. He had been polite every single time. He had smiled at receptionists who looked at him with tired eyes and handed him forms he had already filled out. He had filled them out again. He had also gone to a city council session, a 4-hour meeting in a room that smelled like old carpet and stale coffee, where his issue had been quietly moved to the bottom of the list and then tabled entirely without explanation. He had sat through all 4 hours. He had not left early. He had waited because he believed that waiting was part of fighting. But that night, walking home in the dark, he had felt something crack a little inside his chest. Not break, just crack. Because Daniel knew what was waiting for him on Mercer Street. He knew the faces. He knew the names. There was Vivian, who was working so hard to stay sober, one day at a time, and who stood to lose her housing support as she was displaced, and her paperwork fell through the cracks the way paperwork always fell through the cracks for people like her. She had a daughter named May who was 7 years old, and who had drawn Daniel a picture of a house once, and written his name on the roof in purple crayon. He still had it. There was Calvin, who worked 2 jobs. One started at 5 in the morning, and one ended at 11 at night. He had a son in middle school who was doing well, better than well, the kind of boy who made his teachers smile. Calvin had told Daniel once, quietly, not looking at him, that the apartment on Mercer Street was the first place his son had ever had his own room, the first time in his life. There were Edmund and Rosa, who were in their 70s and spoke very little English between them. Their son lived in Miami and called every Sunday. They had plants on their windowsill. They had a small photograph of a village they had not seen in 40 years pinned above the kitchen door. They had nowhere else to go. 14 families. 14 stories. 14 reasons Daniel Ware had stitched that satchel strap back together and walked into this building today. He gave his name at the front desk. The young man behind the desk looked at him the way people had been looking at him for 9 days. He typed something. He made a call. He looked up with the practiced blankness of someone who had been trained to reveal nothing and said that Mr. Cole would see him. Richard Cole's office was on the 31st floor. The elevator was fast and silent, and the doors opened onto a room with windows that looked out over the whole city, like it belonged to someone, which in many ways it did. Richard Cole was standing with his back to the door when Daniel walked in. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried the easy confidence of a man who had never once sat in a waiting room chair designed to make him feel small. He turned around slowly. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the torn jacket. He looked at the worn satchel. And something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. It was closer to a decision made in an instant about what kind of conversation this was going to be. Daniel set the satchel down. He looked Richard Cole in the eye, and he said the names. Vivian, Calvin, Edmund, Rosa, all 14 of them. He said what they needed. He said what 60 days would mean. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you say something you have said inside your own head so many times that it becomes familiar as breathing. When he finished, Richard Cole was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You have done all of this," Richard said slowly, looking around his pristine office as if sharing a private joke with it. "And now what? You call somebody? Is that the plan?" Daniel did not flinch. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is the plan." Richard laughed. It was a full laugh, confident and easy, the laugh of a man who had never once been surprised by someone wearing a torn jacket. "Then go ahead," he said, spreading his hands wide. "Call whoever you want." So Daniel reached into the worn satchel. He took out his phone, and he made the call. The laughter stopped. The phone rang twice. That was all. 2 rings, and then a voice came to the speaker, clear and calm and utterly familiar to everyone in that room except, it seemed, to Richard Cole, who had stopped laughing the moment he heard it. His face did not fall all at once. It happened slowly, the way ice melts, starting at the edges. The easy smile softened first. Then the shoulders, which had been pulled back with the relaxed certainty of a man who owned the view from every window in the room, dropped just slightly. His eyes, which had been bright with amusement a moment ago, narrowed, not with anger, with something closer to recognition. The kind of recognition that arrives uninvited and will not be argued with. Daniel said nothing into the phone yet. He simply held it up, steady, the way you hold a candle in a dark room. Not threatening, not triumphant, just present. The voice on the other end said his name first. It said Daniel in the warm, unhurried way of someone who had known him a long time and was not surprised to be hearing from him. Then it asked, simply and directly, if everything was all right. Richard Cole heard that voice and went very still. He knew it. Of course he knew it. In a city like this one, certain voices carry weight the way certain buildings carry history. You do not need to be told who is speaking. You have heard that voice in meeting rooms, in news reports, in the kind of conversations that shape what gets built and what gets torn down and who gets to decide. It was not a voice you expect to come out of a worn brown satchel held by a man in a torn jacket, standing in your office on a Thursday morning. Daniel spoke quietly into the phone. He said he was at Commerce Avenue. He said he was with Richard Cole. He said he'd been trying to reach someone with the authority to pause a demolition order for 60 days, and that every door he had knocked on in 9 days had stayed closed. He said the names again. Vivian, Calvin, Edmund, Rosa. He said them the same way he always said them, without performance. Just fact. The way you say the names of people who are real and present and whose lives are not abstract. There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice asked to speak with Mr. Cole directly. Daniel held the phone out across the desk. Richard Cole took it. His hand, for just a moment, was not entirely steady. What was said in that conversation, only 2 people know for certain. But what happened in that room during those 4 minutes was visible to anyone watching. Richard Cole, who had laughed 2 minutes ago with the full confidence of a man who had never once been caught off guard in his own office, was now listening, not pretending to listen, the way powerful people sometimes do when they are really just waiting for their turn to speak again. Actually listening. His jaw was tight. He nodded once, slowly. He said, "Yes, sir," twice. He said, "I understand," once. Then he handed the phone back to Daniel and stood very still for a moment, looking out at the city through the tall, clean windows. Daniel put the phone back into the satchel. He waited. This was something Daniel Ware had learned over many years of fighting for people who had very little. Silence, when used correctly, is not empty. It is the space where the other person has to decide who they are going to be. You cannot fill that space for them. You can only hold it open and wait. He thought about Calvin while he waited. He thought about the morning 2 weeks ago when he had stopped by Mercer Street early and found Calvin already gone for his first shift, and Calvin's son sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, before school with a pencil that was worn down to almost nothing. The boy had looked up and smiled and asked Daniel if he wanted some cereal. There had been one bowl left. The boy had offered it without hesitation. He thought about Rosa, who had pressed a small bread roll wrapped in a cloth napkin into his hands the last time he visited, because that was what she did when she wanted to say thank you and did not have the English words for it. He still had the napkin. It was in the satchel. He thought about Vivian, who had told him once, late in the evening when her daughter May was asleep on the couch between them, that the hardest part of trying to get better was not the getting better itself. It was a feeling that the world was always moving just slightly faster than she could keep up with, and that one wrong step, one misform, one lost letter, one careless decision made by someone who had never met her and never would, could pull the floor out from under everything she had worked so hard to build. She had not cried when she said it. She had just looked at him with steady eyes and said, quietly, I just need time to not be running. Daniel, just a little time to breathe. 60 days. That was all he was asking for. Not a miracle, not a monument. Just 60 days for 14 people to find their footing before the ground shifted beneath them. Richard Cole turned away from the window. He looked at Daniel with an expression that was different now from anything that had been on his face since Daniel walked in. The amusement was gone. The easy confidence was still there, but it had moved aside to make room for something else. Something quieter. Something that looked, if you watched carefully, like the very beginning of discomfort. Not guilt yet, but the thing that comes just before guilt, when a person starts to see clearly for the first time and does not entirely like what they see. He looked at the satchel. He looked at the jacket. He looked at Daniel's face, which had not changed once since he walked in. Not when Richard laughed. Not when he made the call. Not now. How long have you been doing this? Richard asked. His voice was different too. Lower. Less rehearsed. Daniel considered the question honestly. Long enough to know that the people I fight for cannot afford for me to stop, he said. Richard was quiet again. Then he said something that surprised them both, or at least surprised himself. You knocked on every door first, he said. It was not quite a question. It was more like a man reading something written on a wall and saying it aloud to make sure he has understood it correctly. Every one, Daniel said. The city outside the window kept moving. Cars far below. People too small to see clearly. Somewhere out there, on a street called Mercer, 14 families were going about their Thursday, not knowing that in a glass room 31 floors above the ground, the man who held their immediate future in his hands was standing very still and beginning, for the first time, to feel the full weight of that. Richard Cole sat down. It was such a small thing. He simply pulled out his chair and sat down in it. The way a man sits when a performance is over, and what is left is just the truth of the room. He did not reach for his phone. He did not call his assistant. He did not glance at the clock on the wall the way he had been doing since Daniel first walked in, the small, dismissive gesture of a man who has somewhere more important to be. He just sat, and for the first time since Daniel had stepped out of that silent elevator, Richard Cole looked like a person rather than a position. Daniel sat too, not because he had been invited to, because he had earned it. He reached into the satchel one more time, not for phone, but for a single folded piece of paper, soft at the creases from being opened and closed many times. He set it on the desk between them and smoothed it flat with his palm. It was not a legal document. It was not a formal petition. It was a handwritten list of 14 names, written in different handwriting, because Daniel had asked each family to write their own name themselves. Some were neat. Some were shaky. Rose's name was written in the careful, deliberate letters of someone who had learned to write in a different alphabet first, and was still being gentle with this one. May, Vivian's daughter, had written her own name at the bottom in purple crayon, just below her mother's, without being asked. Richard looked at the list. He did not say anything for a long moment. Daniel did not fill the silence. He had learned that, too, over the years. There are moments when words are just a way of running from what is true, and the kindest thing you can do for another person, even a person who has the power to change everything, is to let them sit inside the truth long enough for it to become real to them. Outside the windows, the city moved in its usual way, indifferent and constant, the way cities always move, without pausing for the small, enormous moments that happen inside the room stacked within them. But inside this room, something was shifting. You could not see it the way you can see a building going up or coming down. It was quieter than that. It was a shift that happens inside a person when they stop defending themselves and start actually looking. Richard picked up the piece of paper. He held it in both hands and read every name, all 14 of them. He read them slowly, the way Daniel always said them, without rushing, giving each one its own space. When he got to May's name at the bottom, written in purple crayon, something moved across his face that he did not try to hide. He set the paper down carefully, as if it were something that deserved to be handled with care, which it was. Then he looked at Daniel and asked a question that nobody in 9 days had thought to ask. He said, "What do they need most right now today?" Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. Not the crack he had felt walking home from the council session. Something different. Something opening rather than closing. He answered honestly and specifically, the way he always answered when someone finally asked the right question. Vivian needed her housing paperwork reviewed and supported so that displacement would not trigger a gap in her eligibility. Calvin needed assurance that the timeline would not move without notice because his work schedule left him no room to fight a sudden change. Edmund and Rosa needed someone who spoke their language to walk them through every step of whatever came next, not a form, not a hotline, a real person who would sit with them. All 14 families needed 60 days of stillness, 60 days where the ground did not move, so they could find solid footing and not be swallowed by the speed of a process that had never once considered their names. Richard listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not reach for a pen to take notes the way people sometimes do when they want to look like they are listening without actually doing it. He just listened, with his hands flat on the desk and his eyes on Daniel's face. And when Daniel finished, he nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when something has landed in the place inside you where real decisions are made. He picked up his own phone and made 2 calls. The first was short and direct, a pause on the demolition order. 60 days, effective immediately, no debate. The second was longer, and by the end of it, funding had been arranged, a placement support team had been assigned, and a translator had been requested for Edmund and Rosa's first meeting. Real things, specific things, not promises dressed up in careful language, but the kind of commitments that leave a trail and can be held to. When he put the phone down, he looked at Daniel with something that was not yet humility, but was standing very close to it, close enough to feel its presence. He said, "Simply, I did not see them." He said it the way a person says something they will not forget, because saying it aloud makes it permanent in a way that thinking it never does. Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "You see them now." He picked up the list of names and folded it back along its soft creases and put it in the satchel. He stood up. He thanked Richard Cole, not with warmth that had not yet been earned, but with a steady, dignified courtesy of a man who understands that the beginning of change deserves to be acknowledged even when it is long overdue. Then he picked up the satchel, the worn strap holding just as it always did, and he walked back to the elevator. The ride down was quiet. The lobby was the same as it had been when he walked in. The man in the dark coat was gone. The city outside the glass doors was still moving, still indifferent, still stacked with stories happening all at once in rooms no one else could see. Daniel walked back to Mercer Street. It took him 20 minutes. He knew every block of it. He had walked it so many times it had become a kind of language. The cracked pavement near the corner store, the bench where Edmund sometimes sat in the afternoon sun, the window on the second floor where May had once pressed her face to the glass and waved at him with both hands like he was someone worth waving at. When he turned on to Mercer, Vivian was outside with May, who was drawing something on the pavement with chalk. May looked up and saw him and said his name with the simple, uncomplicated confidence of a child who has never learned to be afraid of hope. He stopped and looked at what she was drawing. It was a house. Purple roof. His name was not on it this time. All 14 names were. He stood there for a moment in the ordinary afternoon light and felt the weight of what 60 days truly meant. Not a victory. Not an ending, a beginning, fragile and real, and earned through 9 days of closed doors and one room where a man with everything had finally chosen to look at people he had only ever seen as numbers on a page. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table and thought about what Richard had said. You knocked on every door first. He thought about why that had seemed to surprise a man who had so much power. He thought about how the world trained certain people to believe that power means never having to knock, that the door should open for you, not because of what you carry, but because of who you are. And he thought about what it means to live on the other side of that belief, in a world full of people for whom no door opens easily, who knock anyway, who keep knocking, who teach their children that knocking is not weakness, but the most honest kind of strength there is. He thought about Calvin's son with his worn pencil and his easy smile. He thought about Rosa's bread roll wrapped in a cloth napkin. He thought about May's purple crayon and 14 names drawn in chalk on a Mercer Street pavement. And he thought about how the most powerful thing he had ever done was not the phone call. It was the staying when it was slow and thankless, and the doors were not open, and the waiting rooms were designed to make him feel small. The staying because the people on Mercer Street had stayed through things far harder than anything he had ever faced, and they deserved someone who would not leave just because it was taking too long. 60 days is not forever. Daniel knew that. There would be more letters to write, more calls to make, more rooms to walk into with a worn satchel and a torn jacket, and a list of names that the world had not yet learned to say with care. But 60 days was today, and today was enough to begin. The door had not been forced open. It had been opened by something quieter and more durable than force, by patience and presence, and the radical, ordinary act of refusing to let 14 human beings become invisible. Daniel folded his hands on the table. Outside, Mercer Street was settling into the evening. Somewhere down the hall, a child was laughing. He sat with that sound for a long time before he finally got up to fix a tear in his jacket. This has been a true life story with Jay. Thank you for watching, and thank you for staying all the way to the end. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from every single one of you. Until next time, keep knocking on every door. The right one will open